The temperature is minus 40 degrees Celsius. The air is so cold it turns your breath into a cloud of ice crystals that can give away your position in seconds. Across the Finnish border, the Red Army is advancing with over 160,000 men. They have tanks, heavy artillery, and the might of a global superpower. Standing against them in the forests of Kola is a man who stands only 5 feet tall. He is wearing a white canvas suit and carrying a rifle that is technically obsolete by modern standards. He doesn't have a scope. He doesn't have a spotter. He doesn't even have a formal military background beyond his mandatory service and civil guard training. But in the next 100 days, he will achieve 542 confirmed kills. That is an average of 5 men per day every single day in the most brutal winter in recorded history. The Soviets will give him a name that still causes a chill in military academies today: Belaya Smrt, the White Death. They will send specialized divisions to find him. They will rain down thousands of artillery shells on empty patches of forest just to kill him. But they will never see him. This is the technical story of Simo Häyhä. He wasn't a soldier. He was a farmer who applied the math of the hunt to the reality of war. The Winter War began on November 30th, 1939, with a technical mismatch of staggering proportions. The Soviet Union expected a parade march into Helsinki that would last 2 weeks. They deployed the 7th Army, a force equipped with nearly 1,000 tanks and massive air support. The Finnish army was a budget force that lacked anti-tank weapons, modern aircraft, and even basic uniforms. The primary defensive line was the Kola River, a frozen strip of land in the middle of a dense pine forest. The Finnish strategy was built on Mutti tactics, using the terrain to segment and isolate the massive Soviet columns. But a Mutti only works if you can stop the enemy from moving forward. Simo Häyhä was assigned to the 6th Company of Infantry Regiment 34. His commander gave him a simple, impossible task: hold the forest. Simo didn't move into the trenches with the other men. He moved into the no-man's land of the deep snow. He understood the technical limitations of the Soviet soldier. The Red Army troops were wearing dark olive uniforms that turned them into perfect silhouettes against the Finnish white. They were forced to stay near the roads because their heavy equipment couldn't navigate the 4 feet of snow. Simo, on the other hand, was on skis. He was a master of biathlon movement, knowing how to manage his heart rate after a fast glide to ensure a steady shot. He treated the forest as his personal laboratory for ballistics. He mapped out the distances to every landmark: a fallen log, a specific birch tree, a bend in the river. He knew exactly how much holdover his rifle needed for a target at 300 meters versus 450 meters. While the Soviets were fighting a war of massed fire, Simo was fighting a war of individual precision. The Red Army soldiers began to notice a terrifying pattern. Men would fall silently without the sound of a distant gunshot. The cold air and the dense trees muffled the report of his rifle, making it impossible to triangulate his position. Simo wasn't just killing soldiers, he was deleting the leadership of entire platoons. He targeted the officers first, knowing that the conscripts would freeze without orders. The Kola front became a psychological graveyard for the 7th Army. They called it the Kola will hold front, but it was held by a ghost. The reality was that one man was effectively doing the work of an entire battalion. He didn't need a bunker or a tank. He just needed his white suit and his bolt-action rifle. The invisible wall was not made of concrete. It was made of a farmer's patience. The Soviets were about to learn that the most dangerous part of the Finnish winter wasn't the frost. It was the man you couldn't see. Every legendary craftsman needs a tool that feels like a natural extension of his own body. For Simo Häyhä, that tool was the M2830 bolt-action rifle. The Finnish soldiers affectionately called it the pistokorva. The name translates to spits, a reference to the front sight protectors that look like the pointed ears of a Finnish hunting dog. This weapon was not a mass-produced piece of junk from a distant, indifferent factory. It was a masterpiece of precision from the SAKO works, refined specifically for the Finnish environment. Simo's specific rifle was serial number 60689. He had spent years mastering the personality and the mechanical rhythm of this specific piece of steel. The rifle was chambered in 7.62 by 53 mm R, a heavy, stable round designed for the sub-zero climate. This bullet was massive enough to punch through thick wool coats and even pine branches without losing its path. While modern snipers usually demand a powerful glass scope, Simo flatly refused to use one. This was a calculated decision based on the brutal reality of the Finnish winter. In 40 below zero weather, the warmth of a man's face creates a cloud of moisture with every breath. On a glass lens, that moisture turns into a layer of white frost in a matter of seconds. A frosted scope is just an expensive, heavy paperweight that leaves a shooter completely blind. There was also the critical problem of the shooter's profile. A telescopic scope sits several inches above the barrel of the gun. To look through it, a soldier must lift his head and neck into the air. In the flat, white landscape of the Kola front, a raised head was a clear silhouette for an enemy. By using the factory iron sights, Simo could press his cheek firmly against the wood of the stock. He became a horizontal shadow that vanished into the mounds of frozen snow. He also understood the danger of light reflection. The winter sun in Finland stays low on the horizon, creating a sharp, horizontal glare. Even a small glass lens can catch this light and create a brilliant flash called glint. To a Soviet counter-sniper, that glint was a beacon that shouted the shooter's exact position. Simo remained invisible because he had no glass to betray him. He relied on his own eyesight, which he had sharpened by tracking game in the forest twilight for decades. He understood the sight picture required for every distance with absolute clarity. The M2830 rear sight featured a specialized wing nut for precise adjustments in the field. Simo could change his aim for a biting crosswind without ever taking his eyes off the target. He didn't just trust the markings on the metal. He knew the trajectory arc of his heavy bullets. A bullet does not fly in a straight line. It flies in a curve that rises and then falls. Simo calculated that curve in his head for every single shot he took. He would watch the way snow blew off the branches of the pine trees to judge the wind speed. He would then hold off his aim to the left or right to let the wind carry the bullet home. While Soviet snipers were fumbling with frozen adjustment knobs on their scopes, Simo was already firing. He even accounted for the cold bore effect. A frozen barrel shoots differently than a warm one because the metal expands and contracts with heat. Simo kept his rifle away from fires to keep the metal at a steady, freezing temperature. He wanted his weapon to be as cold as the air around it to ensure perfect consistency. The iron sights also offered him a much wider field of vision. A scope creates tunnel vision, but Simo could monitor the entire forest with both eyes open. He could spot a flanking maneuver while his sights were still locked on his primary target. The Red Army officers couldn't believe a farmer was this accurate with simple steel. They assumed he must have secret, high-powered optics provided by the Western Allies. But there was no secret equipment. There was only a man who knew his rifle better than he knew himself. He was the ghost in the machine, and the machine was lethally, perfectly simple. Simo Häyhä did not just hide in the forest. He became a functional part of the ecosystem. His survival depended on a level of fieldcraft that bordered on the supernatural. He understood that the human body is a heat signature beacon in a world of absolute white. To combat this, he wore a loose-fitting white canvas suit over his thick wool layers. The loose fabric broke up the hard lines of his shoulders and head, turning him into a shapeless mound of snow. But his most impressive tricks were designed to hide the physical evidence of a gunshot. Most snipers give away their position the moment they pull the trigger. The high-pressure gases escaping the barrel create a muzzle blast that kicks up a cloud of loose snow. In the still, frozen air, that puff of white powder is visible for miles. Simo prevented this by pouring water on the snow directly in front of his firing position. The water would instantly freeze, creating a hard, icy crust that would not move when he fired. He also packed down the snow beneath him with extreme care. He created a shallow trench that masked his muzzle flash from the side, funneling the light straight toward the target. This ensured that even if a Soviet soldier was looking in his direction, there was no visual flare to track. Simo also had to solve the problem of his own biology. In minus 40 degrees, a human breath is a plume of steam that acts like a signaling flare. To hide this, he kept a steady supply of snow in his mouth while he was on the hunt. The snow cooled his breath before it left his lungs, preventing the telltale cloud of vapor. He also kept sugar in his mouth, which helped maintain his energy levels and kept his throat moist. This prevented him from coughing, a sound that carries for hundreds of meters in the silent woods. He would lay in his snow bed for hours without moving a single muscle. He mastered the discipline of active stillness, a state where the body is relaxed, but the mind is hyper-alert. He would watch the Soviet lines, noticing the smallest change in the environment. He looked for the unnatural shapes, the straight line of a rifle barrel, or the curve of a helmet. He understood that the Red Army soldiers were fighting against the forest itself. They would huddle together for warmth, creating a larger, easier target for his rifle. They would light fires to survive the night, effectively marking their own positions for his morning hunt. Simo, by contrast, never used a fire and never stayed in the same spot for more than a day. He moved on skis, allowing him to glide silently through the deep drifts. He would circle around a Soviet camp, attacking from the rear when they expected a frontal assault. He used the dense pine branches to muffle the sound of his shots. By firing from deep within a cluster of trees, the crack of the rifle was absorbed by the wood and needles. The Soviets would hear the sound, but they could never tell which direction it was coming from. They were fighting a ghost who could regulate his own body temperature and hide his own breath. Simo's fieldcraft was a masterclass in environmental integration. He wasn't an intruder in the woods. He was the apex predator. He didn't need a high-powered radio or a spotter to find his prey. He just needed to wait for the enemy to make a mistake. And in the frozen hell of Kala, the Soviets made mistakes every single minute. The White Death was always watching, and he was always cold, patient, and invisible. Most people believe Simo Häyhä was only a master of the long-range rifle. The tally of 542 kills is often attributed solely to his bolt-action M2830. However, the reality of the Winter War was far more violent and up close. Nearly half of Simo's confirmed kills were achieved with a submachine gun. This was the Suomi KP-31, a weapon that redefined close-quarters combat in the forest. The KP-31 was a heavy, rugged piece of machinery chambered in 9mm parabellum. It was famous for its incredible rate of fire, spitting out nearly 900 rounds per minute. For a man like Simo, this weapon was the perfect solution for the Mukti battles. When Finnish troops surrounded a Soviet column, the fighting became a chaotic scramble in the deep snow. The long rifle was too slow for a fight at 10 paces. The Suomi, with its massive 71-round drum magazine, allowed Simo to clear entire squads in seconds. The weapon was built with an extremely heavy barrel jacket which served a dual purpose. It helped manage the intense heat generated by such a high rate of fire. It also provided the weight needed to keep the muzzle from climbing during a long burst. Simo handled the Suomi with the same cold precision he applied to his rifle. He did not believe in spray-and-pray tactics. He used short, controlled bursts of 3 to 5 rounds. He targeted the center of mass, knowing the heavy 9mm slugs would drop a man instantly. The Suomi was also incredibly reliable in the extreme Finnish cold. The internal tolerances were loose enough to prevent the metal from seizing when the oil froze. Simo would often ski into the heart of a Soviet encampment under the cover of a blizzard. He would unleash the fury of the drum magazine and disappear into the white before the first body hit the ground. The Soviets had their own submachine guns, but they were often prone to jamming in the frost. The Finnish Suomi became a symbol of the Sisu, the gritty perseverance of the defenders. Simo's mastery of both the rifle and the submachine gun made him a two-tier threat. He was the ghost that killed you from 400 meters away, and he was the shadow that appeared from behind a tree to shred your platoon with 9mm lead. The sheer volume of fire he could produce gave him the power of a small army. He utilized the drum magazine to create a wall of lead during the Soviet human wave attacks. When the Red Army charged his position, he would wait until they were within 30 meters. Then, the silence of the woods was replaced by the mechanical roar of the KP-31. This weapon allowed Simo to survive being outnumbered 10-1 on multiple occasions. He understood the mechanical rhythm of the Suomi perfectly. He could change a 71-round drum in total darkness while wearing thick wool mittens. This efficiency meant there was almost no gap in his defensive fire. The Red Army soldiers feared the burp of the Suomi more than the crack of the rifle. They knew that if they heard that sound, it was already too late to dive for cover. Simo Häyhä was a farmer, a hunter, and a marksman, but with the Suomi in his hands, he was a force of nature. The White Death was now a master of every distance, and the Soviet casualty lists were about to grow even longer. The Red Army was not just losing men, they were losing their minds. By January 1940, the Soviet 7th Army was paralyzed by a fear they could not name. The soldiers began to whisper about a supernatural force that haunted the Kola woods. They called him Balea Smirt, the White Death. This was not a name given in respect, but in raw, animal terror. The Soviet High Command realized that the morale of their troops was reaching a breaking point. Entire platoons refused to leave their bunkers to go on patrol. They knew that stepping into the white meant stepping into the sights of a ghost. The Soviet officers tried to dismiss the reports as mass hysteria or Finnish propaganda, but the casualty list told a different, undeniable story. Officers were being targeted with a mechanical consistency that suggested a massive team of snipers. The Soviets couldn't believe that a single man was responsible for hundreds of deaths. To explain their failure, they created a myth that the Finns had thousands of cuckoo snipers. They believed these snipers lived in the tops of the pine trees like birds. This led the Soviet troops to spray the treetops with machine gun fire at the slightest sound. In reality, Simo was on the ground, laughing silently at the waste of ammunition. He understood the psychological breaking point of a group of men. He would purposely leave 1 or 2 soldiers alive in a squad after killing their leader. He wanted those survivors to go back to their camp and tell the others about the invisible killer. He was using the fear of the unknown as a weapon of mass disruption. The Red Army responded by trying to outpreach the fear with propaganda of their own. They told the conscripts that the Finnish bandits were weak and starving. But every time a commissar stood up to give a speech, Simo would put a bullet through his cap. The White Death became a ghost story that the Soviet soldiers told about their failing fires. They believed he could see through trees and that he didn't need to breathe. This psychological collapse had a physical impact on the front lines. Soldiers stopped maintaining their equipment because they were too busy watching the trees. They huddled together for comfort, making them even easier targets for a marksman. Simo's tally grew not just because he was a good shot, but because his enemies were defeated before he even fired. He had turned the frozen forest into a massive mental trap. The Soviet leadership finally decided that they had to kill the myth to save the army. They stopped treating him as a local nuisance and started treating him as a strategic objective. They were about to launch a series of counter hunts involving their most elite specialists. The war in the Kola was no longer about territory. It was a hunt for the man who had become the personification of death itself. The White Death was about to face the full weight of a vengeful empire. The Soviet High Command finally realized that they were not fighting a squad. They were fighting a single, localized phenomenon. To kill the White Death, they decided to stop using raw conscripts. They deployed specialized sniper hunter teams recruited from the entire ranks of the NKVD. These men were experienced woodsmen and marksmen trained in the art of the counterkill. They were equipped with the latest SVT-38 semi-automatic rifles and high-powered optics. The hunters moved in pairs, one man searching for the flash of a muzzle, the other ready to fire. They utilized the same cuckoo tactics they accused the Finns of using. They would wait in the high branches or behind thick stumps for days, hoping for a single mistake. But Simo Häyhä was playing a different game entirely. He knew the hunters were coming before they even reached the front lines. He noticed the change in the behavior of the Soviet patrols. The men were moving with more discipline, and their tracks in the snow were cleaner. Simo adapted by becoming even more patient. He would lie in his snow bed for 24 hours without a single movement. He watched the Soviet lines through his iron sights, looking for the tiny telltale signs of a professional. He looked for the glass of a scope catching the morning light. He looked for the way a pine branch moved against the wind. When he found a hunter, he didn't just fire immediately. He would wait for the man to become confident in his own concealment. Then, with a single, practiced squeeze of the trigger, the hunter would become the prey. One by one, the elite Soviet snipers were eliminated by the farmer they couldn't see. Frustrated by the loss of their specialists, the Soviets turned to a much blunter tool. They began to use area denial tactics, raining down massed artillery on the forest. If they couldn't find the man, they would simply destroy the map he was standing on. They used 122mm howitzers to saturate entire square kilometers of the Kola woods. The shells would shred the pine trees, turning them into deadly wooden shrapnel. Simo survived these barrages by digging deeper into the frozen earth and the packed snow. He understood the dispersion pattern of the artillery fire. He knew that the shells rarely hit the same crater twice. As the forest was chewed into a wasteland of black stumps and red snow, Simo remained. He would emerge from the smoke of 100-shell barrage to kill the first Soviet soldier who climbed out of his trench. The Soviets even tried to use tanks to flush him out. But the heavy T-26 tanks were confined to the narrow forest roads. Simo would disable the lead tank with a well-placed shot to the viewport or the external fuel lines. This created a cork that blocked the entire column, making them easy pickings for Finnish anti-tank teams. The hunt for the White Death was failing at every mechanical level. The Soviets were using the weight of an empire to kill a man who weighed 120 pounds, and the man was winning. The myth of the invisible killer was growing stronger with every failed artillery strike. But on March 6, 1940, the law of averages finally caught up with the ghost. A single, lucky shot was about to change everything. March 6, 1940, began like any other day in the frozen hell of the Kola. The sky was a dull, heavy gray, and the forest was choked with the smell of cordite and pine sap. Simo Häyhä moved into his position for what would be his final hunt of the war. By this point, the Soviet High Command had ordered their troops to fire at anything that moved in his sector. They were no longer looking for a man. They were shooting at shadows. During a localized skirmish, a Soviet soldier spotted a slight movement in the brush. He didn't hesitate to line up a shot with his rifle. He wasn't using a precision weapon. He was firing an explosive bullet. These rounds were designed to detonate upon impact with a hard surface, creating a small but violent blast. The bullet struck Simo directly in the left side of his jaw. The impact was catastrophic. The round detonated against the bone, shattering his lower face and tearing through his cheek. Simo's world exploded into a blinding flash of red and white. He fell back into the deep snow, his face a ruin of blood and splintered bone. The Soviet soldier who fired the shot believed he had finally killed the White Death. He reported the kill to his superiors, and for a few hours, the Red Army celebrated. But Simo's comrades from the 6th Company were not about to leave him behind. They crawled through the snow under the heavy fire to reach the fallen marksman. They found him unconscious, his face so badly mangled that half his head was missing. They dragged him back to the Finnish lines, leaving a trail of dark blood on the pristine white snow. The medics at the field hospital looked at the wound and believed he was beyond saving. The blast had destroyed his jawbone, most of his teeth, and a significant portion of his facial muscle. He was placed on a pile of bodies that were destined for the morgue, but a fellow soldier noticed a slight movement in Simo's leg. The White Death was refusing to die. He was rushed into an emergency surgery that was performed without modern anesthesia or proper lighting. The doctors used whatever materials they had to reconstruct what was left of his face. Simo slipped into a deep, dark coma as the surgeons fought to stop the bleeding. His rifle was left in the snow, but the man was now fighting the most difficult battle of his life. The ghost of Kala was clinging to existence by a single, fraying thread. Outside the hospital walls, the war was still raging, but for Simo, everything had gone silent. Simo Häyhä woke up in a world that was suddenly and unnervingly quiet. The signing of the Moscow Peace Treaty on March 13, 1940, had silenced the guns of Kala. For Simo, the battle had shifted from the frozen forest to the sterile wards of a military hospital. His left cheek had been reconstructed using a piece of bone taken from his own hip. This was a pioneering procedure for Finnish surgeons working in a high-pressure wartime environment. The explosive bullet had not just shattered his jaw, it had obliterated the nerve endings in his face. He spent months in a state of near-constant physical agony as his body tried to accept the new bone. He had to learn how to speak again without the full use of his facial muscles. He had to learn how to eat through a straw while his jaw was wired shut for healing. Despite the severity of his injury, his mind remained as sharp as his iron sights. He read the newspapers and learned about the staggering casualty figures from the Winter War. He discovered that he had been promoted from corporal to lieutenant in a single day. This was the largest jump in rank in the entire history of the Finnish Defense Forces. Field Marshal Mannerheim himself had authorized the promotion to honor the White Death. But Simo did not feel like a legendary hero or a supernatural ghost. He felt like a farmer who was missing the spring planting season. As the wound healed, it left him with a permanent, heavy scar that altered the shape of his face. He took the disfigurement with the same sisu that had kept him in the snow for hours. He never complained about the pain or the loss of his former appearance. When the Continuation War broke out in 1941, Simo attempted to re-enlist in the army. He wanted to return to his regiment and help defend the border once again. But the military doctors looked at the reconstructed jaw and the depth of his scarring. They determined that his injuries were too severe for active frontline service. He was a broken instrument that the military could no longer risk in the field. Simo was deeply disappointed, but accepted the decision with his characteristic silence. He spent the remainder of the war years helping to train new generations of Finnish marksmen. He passed on his knowledge of active stillness and the physics of the iron sight. He taught them how to mask their breath and how to treat their rifles like living things. He was no longer the man in the white suit, but his shadow was everywhere on the front. The recovery was not just physical, it was a transition back into the life of a civilian. He had to reconcile the fact that he had killed 542 men with the quiet life of a rural farmer. He did not suffer from the nightmares or the shell shock that plagued many veterans. He viewed his actions as a necessary job that had been performed to the best of his ability. He moved back to his home district and returned to the land he had fought to save. The man who had been the most hunted person in the world was now just a neighbor. He went back to hunting moose and breeding hunting dogs in the quiet Finnish woods. He became a master of the long game, living a life of peace after a century of war. The White Death had been retired, but the farmer was just getting started. The final chapter of his life would be defined not by the trigger, but by the forest. Simo Häyhä lived for 62 years after the final shot was fired at Kola. He moved to the small village of Ruokolahti, near the Russian border he once defended. He spent his days hunting moose and breeding prize-winning Finnish Spitz dogs. The most lethal marksman in history was known by his neighbors as a modest, quiet man. He received thousands of letters from admirers but rarely felt the need to answer them. When asked how he became such a master of the rifle, his answer was a single word: practice. He viewed his service as a debt he owed to the land that fed his family. He never expressed regret for the 542 lives he took during those 100 days. I did what I was told to do, as well as I could, he frequently told reporters. He lived to see Finland remain an independent nation against impossible odds. Simo passed away in 2002 at the age of 96. He remains the highest-scoring sniper in the history of major warfare. The story of Simo Häyhä proves that the most dangerous weapon is a prepared mind. He won by understanding the physics of his environment and the limits of his tools. The White Death turned simple iron sights into a strategic wall of denial. He was a master of the long game, outthinking a superpower from a snowbank. Hit the like button for more breakdowns of history's most effective soldiers. Subscribe to explore the intersection of human grit and mechanical skill. Comment below. Could Simo have done this with a modern scoped rifle? Thanks for watching.